Trump offered to buy Greenland, but Greenland answered, with Europe and Canada instead. In a quiet but seismic geopolitical shift, the island rejected the US and sealed a $3 billion Arctic deal. Here's how Canada just outflanked everyone in the Arctic power game. Greenland's response to Trump's renewed purchase offer in 2025 was direct and unequivocal.
Prime Minister Muta Egede made it clear, we do not want to be Americans, nor Danes, we are Kalalit.
That wasn't just a polite refusal, it was a public declaration of Greenlandic identity and a signal that the island's days of being a bargaining chip between great powers were over.
Egede's message was echoed by Naja H. Nathanielson, Greenland's Minister for Business and Minerals, who stated, "The mineral resources projects contribute to the Greenland government's goal of a self-sustaining economy."
Both leaders were making it clear that Greenland's future would be shaped on its own terms, not dictated by outside interests. Trump's pitch, this time with bipartisan interest in Congress, focused on the economic and security benefits of American control.
He told Congress, "We will make you rich," and referenced Greenland's strategic missile warning systems and untapped mineral wealth.
The thinking in Washington was that money and promises of prosperity would sway Greenland's leaders, but this approach missed the mark. For Greenland, economic offers could not override the push for sovereignty and the desire for independence that has only grown stronger in recent years. Greenland, self-governing within Denmark since 2009, has grown wary of foreign control. The March 2025 elections handed more power to parties favoring greater autonomy. Greenlandic leaders and voters have made it clear they want to move away from any arrangement that looks like colonialism, whether from Denmark, the United States, or anyone else. Trump's offer, framed as a business deal, failed to recognize that the real issue was self-determination. The strategic stakes are high. Greenland sits on shipping lanes that are becoming more important as Arctic ice recedes. Its rare earth minerals, oil, and natural gas are central to the clean energy transition and global defense industries. The US sees Greenland as a critical asset for both economic and military reasons. But when Egede and Nathanielson rejected the American approach, they were doing more than turning down a sale. They were asserting the right to decide how those resources are developed and by whom. Greenland's leadership was also careful not to close the door to all partnerships. Nathanielson pointed out that resource projects must serve the local economy and create jobs for Greenlandic communities. The message was clear: Greenland is open for business, but only on terms that respect its autonomy and deliver real benefits to its people. This wasn't anti-development rhetoric. It was a demand for respect and self-determination. That's why Greenland's rejection of the US mattered. It showed that the island could resist pressure from a superpower and set its own conditions for engagement. And as the US scrambled to figure out its next move, other players were already negotiating. While Washington was still making offers, Europe and Canada were quietly moving in. The $3 billion Arctic coup unfolded in March 2025 when Greenland granted a 30-year mining permit to Greenland and Orthosite Mining, a Danish-French consortium backed by the European Union's Green Fund, the Danish Export Credit Agency, and the European Investment Bank. This was more than a contract. It was a direct challenge to US ambitions in the Arctic. The deal covers anorthosite and rare earth elements in western Greenland, materials that are critical for aluminum, electric vehicles, missile systems, and modern infrastructure. The timing of this move was no accident. The EU's Critical Raw Materials Act, passed in 2023, requires at least 25% of Europe's rare earth imports to come from allied, ethically sourced locations. Greenland, with its deep ties to Denmark and a government prioritizing sovereignty, became the ideal partner. The French Jean Boulle Group leads extraction, and the minerals head straight to European industrial centers, bypassing the US entirely. The US Export-Import Bank floated a $120 million loan to secure a stake, but by then, Greenland's deposits were already locked into European contracts. The fallout hit American industry fast. Lockheed Martin announced delays in its hypersonic weapons testing program, blaming a shortage of molybdenum-based alloys, one of the very resources Greenland now sends to Europe. Raytheon scrambled to find alternative suppliers in Australia and Chile after realizing Greenland's reserves were out of reach. Even clean energy projects tied to the Inflation Reduction Act ran into trouble, as battery material supplies were already spoken for under the New Deal. Greenland's new infrastructure law, passed in 2025, set terms that favored local priorities. 70% of mining jobs must go to Greenlanders, and 10% of profits are set aside for a national future fund. Canadian firms adapted quickly to these requirements, but U.S. companies hesitated, unwilling or unable to commit to these terms. The $3.1 billion Arctic Green Transition Fund, backed by Canada, Norway, and the European Investment Bank, finances sustainable infrastructure in Greenland and excludes U.S. participation, reinforcing the shift in power. This deal gives Greenland genuine leverage. The EU secures a reliable supply of critical minerals and chips away at its dependence on China. Canada gains influence through investment and policy alignment, strengthening its position in the Arctic. U.S. defense contractors face shortages, and America's Arctic strategy looks reactive and slow. The anorthosite deposit alone can meet Europe's aluminum demand for decades, making the arrangement a long-term shift in the region's balance of power. Greenland didn't just say no to Washington, it built a new system where autonomy comes first and resources drive independence. That shift set the stage for another player, one whose Arctic strategy is less about headlines and more about consistent, quiet influence. Canada's Arctic rise is built on a different playbook. While the US chased headlines with big offers and military deployments, Canada quietly extended its mineral exploration tax credit through 2035, adding extra incentives for Indigenous-led projects. This move didn't grab international attention, but it gave Canadian firms a practical edge. Instead of insisting on ownership, Canadian companies focused on shared infrastructure, ports, roads, and power grids. What sets Canada apart is what it avoids. No military buildup, no pressure on Greenland's government, just steady investment and respect for local autonomy. Ottawa's approach is about fiscal incentives and partnership, not control. The U.S. Arctic Doctrine in 2025 listed more new military bases than economic initiatives. Canada, meanwhile, prioritized logistics and training. Its Northern Corridors program spent a third of its budget last year on technical training for Indigenous workers. That's not just a policy difference, it's a philosophy. One side builds runways, the other builds trust. Tesla signed a 5-year deal with Neo Performance Materials, a Canadian firm for Greenland-sourced neodymium. The tax credit let Neo undercut Chinese prices and meet EU local content rules at the same time. General Motors, stuck on the US side, is now scrambling to renegotiate with less reliable Indonesian suppliers. The credibility Canada has built goes beyond mining. When Greenland needed engineers for its new rare earth processing plant, it hired Canadian firms already training local workers. German officials recently added Canada to their critical raw materials club, not because of defense ties, but because Canada can actually deliver. Danish diplomats now check with Ottawa before making Arctic decisions. Washington, by contrast, gets cold answers and little trust. Canada understands that Arctic influence isn't about control. It's about being the partner others choose. Every shipment from a Canadian-funded port chips away at China's monopoly and makes America's purchase offers look out of touch. The reality is, Canada has changed the rules in the Arctic. The US is still playing catch-up, and the next moves are already in motion. The fallout from Greenland's decision landed fast. While the U.S. Export-Import Bank was still reviewing its $120 million loan pledge, Greenland had already sealed a $3 billion deal with Europe and Canada. That gap in speed and scale says a lot about where influence now lies in the Arctic. The contracts Greenland signed weren't just about minerals. They signaled a new alignment, one that leaves the U.S. watching from the sidelines. Europe's motivation was clear. The EU's Critical Raw Materials Act requires that at least 25% of the rare earths used in Europe come from allied sources that meet environmental and human rights standards. Greenland fits that bill, and with China dominating the global rare earths market, the EU needed a reliable, ethical supplier. The partnership with Greenland is a direct answer to Europe's need for supply chain security and a way to challenge China's grip on these essential materials. American officials misjudged how quickly the ground would shift. While US defense planners talked about Arctic bases and military strategy, Europe and Canada locked up the region's critical minerals. Lockheed Martin now faces shortages of terbium and dysprosium, both of which are key for precision weapons because Greenland's output is already committed elsewhere. The US Air Force's Thule base still controls the airspace, but it no longer has access to the minerals under its own feet. This realignment isn't just about supply chains. The EU now consults with Canada before even reaching out to the US on Arctic policy. German manufacturers are signing contracts with Canadian firms for Greenlandic metals, cutting out American middlemen. The shift is practical, not symbolic. Money, jobs, and influence are moving with the minerals. China's reaction is telling. State-owned companies have tried to lure Greenland with higher prices and pressured Mongolia to slow competing exports, but Greenland turned them down, not for loyalty to Europe, but because the EU deal includes technology transfers and promises for local processing. Europe offered something China wouldn't, a path to real economic independence. Meanwhile, the US keeps missing the point. The Navy's latest Arctic strategy still focuses on Russian threats, barely mentioning mineral security. Canada, on the other hand, is funding vocational schools in Nuuk, training Greenlandic workers to run the mines and processing plants themselves. One strategy looks backward, the other looks ahead. Looking forward, the EU may soon expand its Critical Raw Materials Act to cover uranium as Greenland's deposits come online. Canada's tax credits are broadening to support processing facilities, not just mining. The US risks fading into irrelevance in a region it once dominated, not because it lacks resources, but because it failed to see what kind of power actually matters now. Greenland's playbook is out in the open. Use great power competition to win real sovereignty. They balanced Europe against China, Canada against the US, and secured the best deal every time. Now, others are taking notes. Alaska's governor is inviting Japanese firms to bid on rare Earth projects, directly referencing Greenland's approach. The rules of the Arctic game are being rewritten, and the world is watching who adapts next. Instead of military posturing, the new Arctic order is being shaped by 30-year mineral licenses and targeted tax incentives. Canada's quiet strategy in Greenland outmaneuvered America's purchase attempts and China's push for supply dominance. While the US debated a single loan, Europe secured long-term rare earth supplies. While China offered higher prices, Greenland chose partners that prioritized local jobs and sovereignty. So which move mattered more? Greenland's public rejection of Trump, or Canada's patient, partnership-driven approach? Comment below and let me know what you think. One thing's certain, Greenland has asserted real agency, and Canada's model now sets the pace for Arctic influence.